If you study the Cascadia Fault for a living, there are certain combinations of signals you never want to see happening at the same time. Today, they're seeing them. 326 years. That's how long this fault has been locked, loaded, and silent. In the span of an hour, 3 completely separate signals fired at the same time, at the same location, on the same fault system. A small earthquake nobody's covering, a distant rupture 4,000 kilometers away. And a silent underground process quietly squeezing stress into a megathrust that is, statistically, overdue. Individually, each one is boring. Together, the researchers who study this fault for a living are refusing to look away. There's a reason for that. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what they're seeing and why it matters. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The pattern, not the quake. There is a magnitude 4.8 earthquake sitting in the USGS catalogue right now that almost nobody is talking about. It struck the seafloor off the coast of Crescent City, California. Shallow, offshore, brief. The kind of event that gets logged, time-stamped, and forgotten by morning. Seismologists in the Pacific Northwest see events like this dozens of times a year. Small tremors along the Cascadia margin are so routine that automated systems process them before any human even glances at the data. So under normal circumstances, a 4.8 offshore California would generate exactly 0 headlines, 0 emergency briefings, and exactly 0 sleepless nights for the scientists who monitor this system every single day. But here is the thing about normal circumstances. We're not in them right now, because 15 minutes before that 4.8 ruptured off Crescent City, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake tore open the seafloor in the Aleutian Islands, 4,000 kilometers to the northwest. 4,000 kilometers. That is roughly the distance from New York City to London, and yet the seismic surface waves generated by that Aleutian rupture were still travelling through the crust of the Pacific Plate when the Cascadia event occurred. 15 minutes. The kind of timing that makes scientists stop typing and start watching their screens a little more carefully than usual. And that is only 2 of the 3 signals, because at this exact same moment, not last week, not last month, right now, the Cascadia Subduction Zone is experiencing what geologists call an episodic tremor and slip event. That is a slow, silent, underground process in which the lower portion of the subduction zone unlocks and slides, transferring stress upward toward the part of the fault that is locked. The part that has not moved since the night of January 26, 1700. The night the last great Cascadia earthquake sent a tsunami across the Pacific and buried entire First Nations villages on the coast of what is now Washington and Oregon. That earthquake is now 326 years in the past, and the fault responsible for it has been building stress every single day since. 3 signals, 1 small earthquake, 1 distant Aleutian rupture, 1 silent underground loading event. Each of them has a perfectly innocent, individually explainable cause. Scientists encounter each of these signals routinely. None of them, standing alone, would be worth a second look. But they are not standing alone. They are happening simultaneously in the same tectonic system at the precise geographic point where the Cascadia Subduction Zone terminates. And that is an entirely different situation. This is not a story about a single earthquake. It is a story about what happens when a system that has been quietly accumulating stress for over 3 centuries suddenly starts producing signals that, when you lay them side by side, begin to look less like noise and more like a pattern. And the scientists who study this fault for a living, the people who are supposed to be the calmest voices in the room, are refusing to look away. That should mean something to all of us. Here is the concept that will anchor everything you're about to hear. Geophysicists studying complex fault systems have a framework they use informally when multiple independent signals begin to converge around a single location or time window. They call it, roughly, an alignment window. It is not a formal prediction model. It is not a countdown clock. It is more like a recognition that a system under long-term stress occasionally enters a temporary state in which its sensitivity to external perturbations is elevated. A state in which things that would normally pass through the crust without consequence might, under the right conditions, find a system that is already near the edge of what it can hold. The public looks at a magnitude 4.8 and sees noise. Scientists looking at the same event in the same location during the same alignment window see something they cannot easily categorize, and that gap between what the headlines say and what the researchers are actually thinking is exactly where this story lives. Before we can understand why that small quake matters, we need to understand why Cascadia is already loaded. And that story starts not with what just happened, but with what has been building for 326 years. Part 2. The depth problem. No one agrees. One of the first things seismologists look at when a new event appears in the catalogue is its depth. Depth tells you something fundamental about what kind of event you're dealing with, whether it originated in the shallow crust in the deeper plate interface or somewhere in between. And in the case of this 4.8 off Crescent City, that number is already the subject of a quiet but significant disagreement between two of the agencies that monitor global seismicity. The United States Geological Survey initially reported the event at approximately 2.5 kilometers below the seafloor, 2.5 kilometers. That is extraordinarily shallow. For context, most earthquakes in subduction zone environments occur at depths of 10 kilometers or more, and frequently much deeper than that. 2.5 kilometers puts this event in what seismologists call the upper crust, the thin, brittle layer of rock closest to the ocean floor. The European Mediterranean Seismological Centre, which runs its own independent global network, placed the same event at closer to 10 kilometers. That is a fourfold difference. Same earthquake, two reputable agencies, dramatically different answers. Now, before you shrug and say, well, which one is right, understand that this kind of discrepancy in real-time catalogues is not unusual, especially for offshore events. It is actually common. The reason is instrumentation. To precisely locate an earthquake's depth, you need seismic stations distributed both vertically and horizontally around the source. On land, this is achievable. You can build station networks, triangulate arrivals, cross-check waveform models. In shallow offshore environments near subduction trenches, you're working with a sparse, one-sided network of land-based instruments that are all on the same side of the event. The geometry of the problem makes depth resolution notoriously difficult, and real-time automated systems routinely produce preliminary depth estimates that get revised significantly over hours and sometimes days. But here is why this particular depth dispute matters in ways that go beyond routine catalogue housekeeping. At the southern terminus of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, where this earthquake occurred, there are two fundamentally different geological interpretations depending on which depth figure you accept. If the event is at 2.5 kilometers, it is almost certainly occurring within the upper crustal material of the Gorda Plate, the small fragmented tectonic plate that is being subducted beneath North America at this southern end of the Cascadia system. Upper crust deformation in the Gorda system is extremely common. The Gorda Plate is under intense internal stress from the forces acting on it from multiple directions, and it fractures frequently in its own right. A shallow upper crustal event in this setting is mundane, geologically speaking, and would require no special interpretation. If the event is at 10 kilometers, the picture changes. At that depth, in this specific location, you're potentially looking at slip occurring much closer to the actual megathrust interface, the boundary between the Gorda Plate and the overlying North American plate, and slip at or near the megathrust interface during an active episodic tremor and slip event is a fundamentally different kind of signal. It is the kind of depth that puts the event in the conversation about the locked zone and stress state of the fault. 2.5 kilometers, and scientists make a note and move on. 10 kilometers, and they start looking at it in the context of everything else happening right now. The depth ambiguity is not a technicality. The depth ambiguity is part of the story, because the uncertainty itself is the reason scientists are watching closely rather than closing the file. This is worth sitting with for a moment. We live in an era of remarkable scientific instrumentation. We have satellites that can measure millimeter-scale ground deformation from orbit. We have GPS networks so sensitive they can detect the subtle surface inflation and deflation that accompanies slow slip events underground. And yet, for a moderate earthquake that just occurred in a part of the world that is arguably the single most seismically monitored subduction zone in North America, two major agencies cannot agree on a basic parameter like depth within a factor of 4. That is not a failure of science. It is an honest reflection of the limits of what offshore seismology can resolve in real time, especially near trench environments where station coverage is fundamentally constrained by geography. And those limits matter enormously when what you are trying to determine is whether a small earthquake near the edge of a 326-year-old seismic gap belongs in the category of routine background noise, or in the category of signals that deserve a second look during an alignment window that may never have been observed in the modern instrumental record. Part 3. The location is the story. Let us talk about where this happened. Because if depth is the first thing seismologists look at, location is the second, and the location of this 4.8 is not just significant. It is, from a tectonic standpoint, one of the most mechanically complicated patches of real estate on the entire Pacific coast of North America. The earthquake occurred at what geologists call the southern terminus of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. To understand why that matters, you need a basic picture of what is happening here in 3 dimensions. The Cascadia Subduction Zone runs for roughly 1,200 kilometers along the coast, from northern Vancouver Island in Canada down to northern California. Along most of that length, the Juan de Fuca Plate, a fragment of ancient oceanic crust, is diving eastward beneath the North American continent at a rate of about 3 to 4 centimeters per year. This subduction process is what built the volcanic arc you know as the Cascade Range, Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, Mount Shasta. And it is what has produced the Great Cascadia megathrust earthquakes that have torn this coastline apart repeatedly over the last several thousand years. But at the southern end, where this earthquake just occurred, the geometry becomes significantly more complicated. Here, the Cascadia system does not simply end, it collides with 2 other major tectonic features simultaneously, creating what geologists call the Mendocino Triple Junction, the point where 3 separate plate boundaries meet. You have the Cascadia Subduction Zone running down from the north, where the Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates are being subducted. You have the San Andreas Fault System running up from the south, where the Pacific Plate is sliding horizontally past the North American Plate in one of the most famous transform boundaries on Earth. And where these 2 systems intersect, you have a mess of crustal deformation that has no clean analogue anywhere else on the west coast. To understand why this makes things so complicated, think of it this way. At most points along Cascadia, the fault system behaves like a giant zipper. Stress builds along the interface, the plates lock together, and eventually something gives in a great rupture. The forces are large, but they are acting in relatively coherent directions. Now imagine taking that zipper and running it directly into a meat grinder. That is roughly what happens at the Mendocino Triple Junction. The forces coming from 3 different plate boundaries are acting at different angles, different rates, and different depths simultaneously. The Gorda Plate, which is the southern fragment of the Juan de Fuca system, is being pulled apart internally even as it is being subducted, making it one of the most internally deformed oceanic plates on Earth. This is not academic. The internal deformation of the Gorda Plate means that the southern Cascadia system does not behave like a single, coherent fault. It behaves like a network of faults, a distributed web of fractures and stress concentrations that interact in ways that are genuinely difficult to model. Scientists sometimes call this the difference between a fault line and a fault network, and the distinction is critical for interpreting any individual earthquake in this region. When a 4.8 occurs right at the southern terminus of Cascadia, at the Mendocino Triple Junction, you cannot simply look at the magnitude and say, small event, routine, move on. You have to ask which part of this enormously complicated fault network produced it, what that implies about the stress state of the system, and how it connects to everything else going on in the region right now. The location is not just a dot on a map. The location is the question mark that turns a routine seismic event into something that scientists studying Cascadia cannot easily explain away. And when you add the Aleutian timing and the active slow slip loading and the 326-year background, that question mark starts to look a lot like the center of something that deserves very careful attention. And it is about to get even more interesting, because 15 minutes before that 4.8 appeared in the catalogue, something very large happened very far away. And the physics of how seismic energy travels through a connected plate system means the timing is not as coincidental as it might first appear. Part 4, the Aleutian precursor, 4,000 kilometers to the northwest of Crescent City, deep beneath the waters of the Bering Sea, the the Pacific plate slammed into the North American plate with enough force to generate a magnitude 5.8 earthquake in the Aleutian island chain, specifically in the segment known as the Rat Islands area. The Aleutian Arc is one of the most seismically active plate boundaries on the planet. It stretches like a curved blade for nearly 2,000 kilometers from mainland Alaska out toward Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, and it has produced some of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. A 5.8 in the Aleutians is a thoroughly ordinary event. NOAA's Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued a routine assessment, confirmed no damaging tsunami potential, and the alert cycle closed within minutes. No damage, no injuries. From a public communication standpoint, the event was completely unremarkable. 15 minutes later, a 4.8 ruptured off Crescent City, California, at the exact southern terminus of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Now, seismic surface waves travel through the Earth's crust and mantle at speeds that vary depending on the type of wave and the material they're moving through. But a rough working figure for the surface waves that carry the most energy over long distances is somewhere between 3 and 5 kilometers per second. Over a distance of 4,000 kilometers, that puts the arrival of the most energetic surface waves from the Aleutian rupture at the Cascadia margin at approximately 13 to 22 minutes after the source event, which means that when the 4.8 occurred off Crescent City, the Aleutian surface waves were not merely on their way. They had already arrived, or were in the process of arriving, at the Cascadia margin. This is a critically important physical fact, and it is the reason scientists are paying attention to the timing rather than treating these as two completely unrelated events that happen to occur in the same hour. The phenomenon that connects these two events in theory, and I want to be very clear that the word theory is doing real work here, is called dynamic triggering. The idea is that passing seismic waves from a distant earthquake can, under the right circumstances, nudge a fault that is already near its failure threshold into producing a small earthquake. It might have produced anyway, but perhaps not for another hour or another day or another month. The key phrase there is near its failure threshold. Dynamic triggering, where it occurs at all, requires a preloaded system. It does not create stress. It releases stress that was already there, waiting. And here is what makes this Aleutian connection genuinely interesting rather than merely coincidental. The Pacific Plate does not end at the Aleutian Trench and begin again at the Cascadia Trench. It is one continuous slab of lithosphere, and its tectonic behaviour at one point along its boundary is mechanically connected at some level to its behaviour at every other point. The Aleutian Arc and the Cascadia Arc are part of the same plate boundary system, separated by thousands of kilometres, yes, but connected through the mechanics of a shared plate that is under stress everywhere along its edges simultaneously. NOAA's tsunami assessment confirmed no risk, and no one is suggesting the Aleutian event was anything other than routine. But routine and isolated are not synonyms, and the 15-minute gap between these two events, at these two locations, during the current stress state of the Cascadia system, is the kind of timing that does not get filed away without a second look. Part 5. Dynamic triggering, but only if conditions are right. Dynamic triggering sounds dramatic when you describe it in plain English. A distant earthquake shakes a fault and sets off another earthquake somewhere else. It conjures images of seismic chain reactions spreading across continents, one rupture triggering another like dominoes falling across a tectonic map. The reality is considerably more restrained, and understanding the constraints is essential to understanding why scientists are being careful rather than alarmed. For dynamic triggering to occur, several conditions must be met simultaneously, and most of them involve the receiving fault being already very close to failure. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a rock balanced on the edge of a table. If that rock is sitting firmly in the centre of the table, you could pass a truck by outside and the vibrations from the engine would not move it. But if that rock is already teetering on the very edge, barely in contact, the vibration from someone walking down the hallway might be enough to knock it off. The surface waves from a distant earthquake are the vibrations. The rock is the fault, and whether that rock falls depends almost entirely on how close to the edge it already is, not on the strength of the vibration. Multiple well-documented cases of dynamic triggering have been recorded in the modern seismic era. One of the most frequently cited occurred following the magnitude 7.3 Landers earthquake in California in 1992, which appeared to trigger seismicity at Yellowstone, the Geysers geothermal field, and several other locations distributed across the western United States. More recent work has examined triggering relationships between large subduction zone events and distant fault systems, finding that the effect is real but highly selective. The vast majority of faults show no measurable response to passing surface waves from even very large earthquakes. The ones that do respond are the ones that were already loaded. That last detail is precisely why the current situation at Cascadia commands attention. The southern Cascadia margin is not a randomly selected fault sitting at some unknown point in its loading cycle. It is a specific fault at a specific location that is currently experiencing an active episodic tremor and slip event that is transferring stress upward into the locked zone. The loading is not hypothetical. It is measurable, it is ongoing, and it is happening right now. And a system that is actively being loaded from below is, by definition, closer to the edge than it would be at some other point in the slow slip cycle. This does not mean the Aleutian surface waves triggered the Crescent City event. The honest scientific answer is that we cannot demonstrate causation here. What we can say is that the conditions under which dynamic triggering is considered physically plausible are currently present at the southern Cascadia terminus, and that the Aleutian event occurred at exactly the time window when those waves would have been sweeping through the region. Whether the 4.8 would have occurred on the same day without the Aleutian rupture is unknowable. Whether the Aleutian surface waves passed through a fault that was close to its failure threshold and provided the final small perturbation, that is the question that cannot be answered with the data we have, and that is precisely why scientists are not willing to dismiss the timing as pure coincidence without further analysis. Part 6. 1. Plate, not 2 events. There is a conceptual shift that is worth making explicit here, because it changes how you understand the relationship between the Aleutian rupture and the Cascadia event. Most people think about tectonic plates the way they think about countries on a map, bounded regions with clear edges, internally uniform, each doing their own thing until they bump into a neighbour. Under that mental model, something happening in the Aleutians is just that, something happening in the Aleutians far away irrelevant to California. But that is not how plate mechanics actually work. The Pacific Plate is a single, continuous mass of lithosphere moving as a coherent unit across the Earth's surface. When it collides with the North American Plate in the Aleutian arc and generates a 5.8 earthquake, the energy from that rupture does not simply radiate outward and disappear. It creates stress redistributions within the plate, subtle, long wavelength changes in the stress field that propagate through the lithosphere at a variety of timescales. The surface waves arrive in minutes. The subtler, quasi-static stress changes in the broader plate system can take hours to days to reach equilibrium after a significant rupture. Geoscientists have studied this phenomenon in the context of what they sometimes call plate-scale mechanical coupling, the idea that tectonic plates do not respond to stresses only at their immediate boundaries, but carry those stresses distributed across their entire mass. The work on this is not deterministic. Nobody is drawing a line from the Aleutian event to the Crescent City event and saying this caused that. The science is probabilistic and the uncertainties are large, but researchers who study multi-region seismic clustering have documented enough cases of temporally clustered activity across geographically distant portions of the same plate boundary system to take the possibility seriously as a frame for interpretation. What this framing suggests is something specific about how we should think about the 50-minute gap. Rather than asking whether these are two independent events that happen to occur close together in time, the more sophisticated question is whether they are two expressions of a single stress field state that manifested at different points along the same connected plate boundary system. Not one causing the other in a simple mechanical chain, but both reflecting the current stress configuration of a shared tectonic architecture that has been under continuous loading for 326 years. The Aleutian rupture did not create the stress at Cascadia. Cascadia created its own stress over centuries. What the Aleutian event may have done, and this is a carefully qualified may, is interact with a system that was already at a point of elevated sensitivity, at exactly the moment when a slow slip event was actively redistributing that stress toward the locked zone. That is not science fiction. That is physics operating at the scale of a tectonic plate, which is a very large and very patient machine. And to understand why the machine at Cascadia is in the specific state it is in right now, you need to go underground, about 25 to 40 kilometers underground, where a silent process has been running for the last several weeks without producing a single earthquake that would register on a home seismograph. What is happening down there is in some ways the most important part of this entire story. Part 7, ETS as an active loading mechanism. Beneath the surface of the Pacific Northwest, there is a process occurring right now that most people have never heard of, and that seismologists have only understood in detail for about 25 years. It goes by the name episodic tremor and slip, and it is in a sense the hidden engine that makes Cascadia so dangerous. Here is how it works. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is not uniformly locked from the surface all the way down to the mantle. It has distinct zones. The upper portion, roughly from the trench out to somewhere beneath the coastline, is the part that is fully locked during the interseismic period between great earthquakes. The two plates are essentially welded together here, and as the oceanic plate continues to move, the overriding North American plate is being dragged downward and seaward, storing enormous amounts of elastic strain energy that will eventually be released in a great rupture. This is the locked zone, and it is the part of the system that geophysicists watch most carefully. But below the locked zone, things are different. In the transition zone, where the interface is too warm and too deep for the kind of fully brittle locking that characterizes the upper fault, the plates interact in a more complex way. Periodically, on cycles that typically range from several months to over a year, depending on where you are along the margin, the deep interface in this transition zone suddenly begins to slip. Not fast, violent slip like an earthquake. Slow, silent creep that unfolds over days to weeks. This slow slip event is accompanied by a kind of seismic radiation called tremor, a high-frequency, low-amplitude signal that looks nothing like a conventional earthquake on a seismogram, but is now understood to represent the collective activity of countless tiny slip events occurring along the deep interface. The episodic tremor and slip cycle matters for Cascadia hazard assessment because of what it does to the stress state of the locked zone above it. When the deep interface slips during an ETS event, it transfers stress upward. The locked zone, which was already holding a significant elastic strain load from decades or centuries of plate convergence, receives an additional stress pulse from the slow slip below. The shallow locked zone does not rupture during ETS. The stresses are not large enough or fast enough for that. But the conditional probability of a great earthquake is slightly elevated during and immediately following a slow slip event, because the fault is being loaded from two directions simultaneously, from the ongoing plate convergence above and from the slow slip transfer below. Scientists monitoring Cascadia are currently tracking elevated tremor activity in the Northern California cluster associated with this slow slip cycle. The tremor episode counts are in a range 114 to 153 individual tremor episodes recorded regionally, that places this current ETS event well within the active phase of the loading cycle. The slow slip is not something that happened last month and is now winding down. It is happening right now. The stress transfer is ongoing, and the 4.8 that appeared off Crescent City did not appear in a system that was quietly resting between loading events. It appeared in a system that is currently mid-pulse in an active slow slip cycle. Receiving stress from below at exactly the same time, the Aleutian surface waves swept through the region from above. The fundamental point about Cascadia's current stress state is this: ETS is not a pressure valve. This is a misconception that surfaces repeatedly in public discussions of Cascadia hazard. The slow slip of ETS does not release the stress of the locked zone, it redistributes it. The deep interface releases some of its own accumulated strain, but in doing so, it pushes harder on the locked zone above. If you were hoping that ETS events mean the fault is periodically bleeding off dangerous energy, the science says the opposite. ETS keeps the locked zone in a state of dynamic stress loading, not periodic relief. Part 8, Southern Cascadia, is the irregular segment. Now here is where the situation becomes specifically concerning in the context of today's signals, because not all of Cascadia is the same, and the part that is most relevant to the 4.8 off Crescent City is the part that scientists understand least well. The northern segment of Cascadia, the portion running beneath Washington and British Columbia, is relatively well characterized. Its ETS cycles are regular enough that researchers have been able to establish roughly predictable recurrence intervals, typically around 14 months between major slow slip events. The GPS networks in Washington and southern British Columbia are dense enough to capture the surface deformation associated with ETS in reasonable detail. The tremor catalogues are robust. Scientists who work on northern Cascadia have access to a reasonably complete picture of the system's behaviour. The southern segment from approximately the Oregon-California border down to the Mendocino Triple Junction is a different story. The ETS behaviour in southern Cascadia is fragmented, irregular, and poorly constrained compared to the north. The tremor episodes in this region are less organised, the slow slip signals are harder to isolate from the general background deformation noise, and the recurrence cycles are not well enough characterised to establish clear periodicity. Part of the reason for this is fundamental geology. The Gorda Plate's internal deformation and the complexity of the Mendocino Triple Junction create a more chaotic mechanical environment that simply does not produce the clean, predictable ETS signatures seen in the north. But another part of the problem is instrumentation. The southern Cascadia margin is under-instrumented relative to its northern counterpart. There are fewer GPS stations in the relevant geometry, fewer borehole seismometers, and less continuous monitoring infrastructure in the offshore environment, where a significant portion of the relevant deformation is occurring. This means that even when something important is happening in the southern segment, as appears to be the case right now, with elevated tremor counts in the Northern California cluster, scientists are working with a sparser dataset than they would prefer. The current tremor clustering in this region is not subtle. The episode counts are elevated, the spatial distribution of the tremor sources is concentrated in a pattern that is consistent with an active slow slip event beneath the southern segment, and the timing puts this ETS activity squarely overlapping with the occurrence of the 4.8. But because the southern segment has such poor historical ETS characterization, scientists cannot easily say whether the current episode is typical of what this segment does periodically, or whether it represents something unusual in terms of its intensity, duration, or spatial extent. This irregularity is not a reassuring feature. It is precisely what makes the southern terminus so difficult to model and so difficult to interpret when new signals appear. A well-characterized system with irregular behavior can be placed in context. An irregular system at the edge of a 326-year seismic gap, producing elevated tremor counts during an active slow slip event on the same day that a shallow earthquake occurs at its terminus and a distant plate boundary rupture sweeps surface waves through the region. That is a system where interpretation requires significant caution in both directions. You cannot confidently say this is fine any more than you can confidently say this is alarming, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of scientific signal. Part 9. The unobserved scenario. There is a phrase that appears in scientific literature when researchers are grappling with an event that has no clear modern precedent. They call it an observation gap, a situation where the combination of conditions that would allow a specific phenomenon to be measured and understood simply has not occurred within the modern instrumental record. And when it comes to the specific configuration of signals at southern Cascadia right now, we are in territory that has no clean modern analogue. Consider what would need to be true simultaneously to produce a situation comparable to today's for scientific analysis. You would need an active ETS event in the southern Cascadia segment, which itself occurs with uncertain periodicity and poorly defined timing. You would need a shallow earthquake occurring at the southern terminus, in the complex mechanical environment of the Mendocino Triple Junction, at a depth that places it ambiguously near the megathrust interface. And you would need all of this to occur within a 15-minute window of a moderate to large earthquake at a connected segment of the same plate boundary system, during a phase of the Cascadia loading cycle where the fault is at or beyond the statistical 80th percentile of its expected recurrence interval. That is 4 rare conditions stacking simultaneously, and as far as the available scientific record indicates, this specific combination has not been observed before in the modern instrumental period for the southern Cascadia terminus. Researchers sometimes reference the 2001 Nisqually earthquake in Washington as a loose analogue for studying how the Cascadia system responds to stress perturbations, but the comparison is imperfect for multiple reasons. The Nisqually event occurred well inland, at a depth of 52 kilometers, in a completely different tectonic context. It was not at the southern terminus, it did not occur during a documented ETS event in the southern segment, and it was not preceded by a temporally clustered distant rupture at a connected plate boundary. As analogues go, Nisqually gives some useful information about how the Cascadia system can respond to stress perturbations. but it does not map cleanly onto what is happening right now in the Northern California offshore. The combination of shallow depth, uncertain interface proximity, active ETS loading, and temporal correlation with a distant plate boundary rupture at the precise geographic termination of the Cascadia system represents what geophysicists would call a first-order observation gap, the instrumentation that would be needed to definitively characterize this event. Ocean bottom seismometers deployed directly above the southern megathrust, high-resolution offshore GPS arrays, direct borehole measurements near the trench, simply does not exist at the density required to resolve the ambiguity. Scientists are watching through a window that is too small for the view they need. This is, ultimately, why the researchers who study Cascadia for a living are not dismissing the 4.8. Not because they believe a megaquake is imminent, not because they have evidence that a rupture is beginning, but because the combination of signals is unusual enough and the available data sparse enough that the honest scientific response is to watch more carefully and wait for more information, rather than to reach for a reassuring explanation that the data does not yet support. The absence of a clear explanation is itself a scientific observation, and the accumulation of individually explainable signals into a pattern that resists easy explanation is precisely the kind of situation that responsible scientists refuse to wave away. Which brings us to the question that none of these individual signals can answer on their own. How long has Cascadia been building toward this moment? The answer to that question requires going back 326 years to the last night the Pacific Northwest coast looked the way it looks today, and understanding what that passage of time actually means for the probability of what comes next. Part 10. The clock isn't just long, it's statistically strange. Let's go back to a specific moment, not a general era, not a geological period, a specific night, January 26th, 1700, approximately 9 o'clock in the evening Pacific time, though nobody called it that yet because the Pacific Northwest as we know it didn't exist. What existed was a coastline populated by indigenous communities who had lived alongside this fault system for thousands of years. Communities with oral traditions that described the ocean behaving in ways that made no sense, water pulling back from the shore, then returning with catastrophic force. Stories that, for a long time, Western science dismissed as mythology. It turns out those stories were eyewitness accounts, precise ones. On that January night, the full length of the Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptured, all of it. From northern Vancouver Island down to northern California, roughly 1,200 kilometers of fault interface, let go simultaneously in a magnitude 9 or greater earthquake. To put that in perspective, a magnitude 9 releases approximately 30 times more energy than a magnitude 8. It is not a bigger version of the same thing. It is a categorically different event. The shaking lasted several minutes, not seconds, minutes. Long enough that anyone standing on the coast would have had time to understand in a visceral and terrifying way that something fundamental had changed about the ground beneath their feet. The tsunami that followed crossed the Pacific Ocean in less than a day. And here is the detail that makes this story remarkable from a scientific standpoint. We know the precise date of this earthquake not primarily because of geology, but because of Japanese historical records. The tsunami arrived on the coast of Japan with enough force to destroy homes and kill people in fishing villages that had received no warning, because the earthquake that generated the wave was on the other side of an ocean, in a part of the world that those villages had no knowledge of or connection to. Japanese officials at the time documented what they called an orphan tsunami, a wave with no locally felt earthquake to explain it. They recorded the date, the height of the water, the villages affected, the damage done, with a precision that would be remarkable even by modern standards. Those records are what allow geoscientists today to pin the last great Cascadia earthquake to a specific night, 3¼ centuries ago. Not a range, not an approximation, a night. Since that night, the fault has been locked. The Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates have continued doing exactly what tectonic plates do, moving, converging with the North American continent at roughly 3 to 4 centimeters per year. Slow, relentless, indifferent to human civilization. Over 326 years, that rate of convergence adds up to approximately 10 to 13 meters of relative plate motion that has not been accommodated by fault slip. 10 to 13 meters of movement that the fault refused to make. That energy didn't disappear. Physics doesn't allow it to disappear. It went into the rocks, stored as elastic strain in the subduction interface and the overriding plate, like a spring being compressed 1 millimeter at a time for 3 centuries. That energy is still there. It is not going anywhere. It is waiting. Here is where I need to be very careful with language, because this is the part of the Cascadia story that gets distorted most often, in both directions. You will hear people say the fault is overdue, with a tone that implies catastrophe is around the corner, and you will hear scientists push back on that word so hard that the impression left is that there's nothing particularly concerning about the current moment. Both of those positions are wrong, and understanding why requires spending a minute on what the paleoseismic record actually tells us. Paleoseismology is the science of reading past earthquakes from the geological record. For Cascadia, the primary tool is turbidite analysis. Turbidites are layers of underwater sediment, sand, silt, organic material, that get disturbed and redeposited when a major earthquake shakes the seafloor. Over thousands of years, these layers accumulate in deep ocean sediment cores, like pages in a book, each one representing a major rupture event. Scientists drill these cores from research vessels, bring them to the surface, and read them, counting layers, dating them, building a timeline. That timeline, covering approximately the last 4,000 years of Cascadia's seismic history, gives us a recurrence record, a list of how long the fault waited between great ruptures across multiple cycles. And the number that emerges from that record is not a single clean answer. It is a range. The Cascadia megathrust recurrence interval varies considerably, averaging somewhere between 200 and 500 years, with a central tendency, the most common interval, clustering around 200 to 240 years for full margin ruptures that break the entire fault simultaneously. Now do the math with me for a second. If the average recurrence interval is somewhere around 200 to 240 years, and the fault last ruptured in 1700, then we are currently at 326 years. We have already exceeded the average. We have already exceeded the most common interval in the paleoseismic record. And geoscientists have calculated, using the full 4,000-year dataset, that the current elapsed time sits at roughly the 80th percentile of observed recurrence intervals. Let me translate that into plain language, because the 80th percentile is doing a lot of work in that sentence and it deserves to be unpacked. 80th percentile means this. If you line up every recurrence interval in the last 4,000 years of Cascadia's history from shortest to longest, approximately 80% of them are shorter than the time that has already passed since 1700. The current waiting period is longer than 80% of the waiting periods in the historical record. We are in the upper tail of the distribution, not at the extreme end. There are intervals in the record that are longer than 326 years, and we will come back to that. But well past the middle, well past average. This is what scientists mean when they talk about statistical position, and this is precisely why the word overdue is both intuitively understandable and technically misleading at the same time. Faults do not work on schedules. There is no geological clock that ticks down to a predetermined rupture date. The physical processes that drive a megathrust earthquake, the accumulation of stress, the eventual failure of the locked interface, the cascade of events that turn slow elastic loading into catastrophic rupture, are complex, non-linear, and influenced by factors that current science cannot fully measure or predict. An elapsed time at the 80th percentile of the historical distribution does not mean the fault is about to break. It does not mean rupture is imminent. It does not mean you should be building a bunker or moving inland. What it means is something more subtle, and in some ways more important than a simple countdown would be. It means the probability of rupture in any given decade is elevated, meaningfully elevated, relative to what it would be if the fault had last ruptured 50 years ago, or even 100 years ago. It means the fault has exceeded its median recurrence interval, and is now in a part of its loading cycle where, historically, great earthquakes become increasingly likely with each passing year. It is a statement about where the system sits in its probability distribution, not a prediction, a position, and that position matters enormously when you're trying to interpret new signals. Here is the part that does not get explained often enough, and that I think is genuinely important for understanding why the current alignment of signals deserves attention rather than dismissal. Imagine two identical earthquakes, same magnitude, same depth, same location, same tectonic context. One of them occurs on a fault that ruptured 40 years ago. The other occurs on a fault that hasn't ruptured in 326 years. Are those two earthquakes equally interesting from a hazard standpoint? The answer clearly is no. The signals are identical. The background context is completely different. This is what scientists mean when they talk about conditional probability. The significance of any individual signal, an unusual tremor, a shallow earthquake at the fault terminus, a temporal correlation with a distant rupture, cannot be evaluated in isolation. It has to be evaluated against the background state of the system. And the background state of the Cascadia system right now is not neutral. It is not early in the loading cycle, where reassuring explanations for ambiguous signals come easily and naturally. It is in a statistical regime where the fault has already exceeded most of its historically observed recurrence intervals, and where every new signal appears against a background probability that is already elevated above baseline. Think of it this way. If a friend who has never shown any symptoms of heart trouble mentions that they had a slightly unusual heartbeat for a few seconds this morning, you might say, "Probably nothing, keep an eye on it." If a friend who's in their 70s has a family history of cardiac events and is already at elevated risk mentions the same symptom, you send them to a cardiologist. The symptom is identical. The context transforms the interpretation entirely. That is the situation at Cascadia right now. The signals appearing at the southern terminus, the 4.8, the Aleutian timing correlation, the active ETS loading, are appearing in a system that is not young and not recently reset. They are appearing in a system that is statistically in the part of its history where great ruptures have repeatedly occurred. A system that has been quietly storing energy at 3 to 4 centimeters per year for 326 years. A system where 10 to 13 meters of unaccommodated plate motion are sitting in the rocks of the subduction interface, held in place by friction, waiting for the conditions that will finally exceed what that friction can hold. That waiting is not passive, it is not inert, it is an active physical state, a compressed spring, a drawn bow, that makes every new signal that appears in this system worth looking at more carefully than it would be worth looking at anywhere else on the planet. 326 years is not a countdown, but it is a context, and in seismology, context is everything. Part 11, Non-Stationary Recurrence, the Hidden Shift. Here is a complication that does not often make it into popular discussions of Cascadia hazard, but that seismologists consider critically important for interpreting the current situation accurately. And I want to spend real time on this because it is the part of the Cascadia story that most fundamentally changes how you should think about the 326-year number we just established. Most people, when they hear that a fault has an average recurrence interval of 200 to 300 years, build a mental model that looks something like this. The fault ruptures, resets, loads up again over a few centuries, ruptures again, resets again. A regular cycle, like a geological clock with some acceptable variation around the mean. The interval might be a little longer one time, a little shorter the next, but it clusters reasonably around its average in a way that makes the average a useful predictive tool. Under that mental model, knowing the average interval and knowing how long it's been since the last rupture gives you a meaningful answer to the question of where you are in the cycle. That model is intuitive, it is clean, and for Cascadia, the evidence suggests it may be fundamentally wrong. The paleoseismic record from Cascadia is not simply a random sequence of earthquake intervals, distributed around a stable average. When researchers look at the full 4,000-year turbidite record in detail, not just the summary statistics but the actual sequence of intervals, one after another, across dozens of rupture events, they find something that complicates the simple clock model considerably. The recurrence interval has not been constant over time. It has not even behaved as if it were randomly varying around a stable mean. Instead, the record shows something more structured and more unsettling. Periods where great Cascadia earthquakes cluster together in relatively rapid succession, separated by intervals that are shorter than the long-term average, followed by periods where the intervals stretch significantly longer than average, bursts of activity, then long silences, clustering, then gaps. A rhythm that is not a simple rhythm at all, but something more complex and harder to read. This behavior has a name. Scientists call it non-stationarity in earthquake recurrence, and it has profound implications, not just for hazard assessment in the abstract, but for the specific question of how we should interpret the current moment at Cascadia. Let me try to make this concrete, because non-stationary recurrence is one of those scientific phrases that sounds precise, but can blur into abstraction if you don't anchor it to something tangible. Imagine you're tracking the behavior of a river. Over a long period of observation, you calculate that the river floods, on average, once every 10 years. Simple enough. Now imagine that when you look more carefully at the historical record, you discover the floods don't actually come at roughly 10-year intervals. Instead, they tend to cluster. 3 floods in 8 years, then nothing for 30 years, then 2 floods in 5 years, then a long quiet stretch again. The average is still roughly 1 flood per decade, but the average is masking a structure in the data that makes it a poor guide to what to expect next. If you are currently 15 years into a quiet stretch, the relevant question is not, we're 5 years past the average, so how worried should we be? It is, are we in one of those long quiet phases, or are we approaching the end of one and the beginning of a cluster? That is non-stationarity, and that is what the Cascadia turbidite record appears to show. The implications are genuinely uncomfortable, because they cut in 2 directions simultaneously, and neither direction is reassuring in the way you might hope. When researchers confront the non-stationary structure of the Cascadia paleoseismic record, they arrive at 2 broad interpretive frameworks that lead to very different conclusions about the current hazard state, and the scientific community is genuinely divided between them. The first framework argues that Cascadia may have entered a longer interval phase in recent geologic time. Under this interpretation, the clustering behaviour visible in earlier parts of the turbidite record represented a period of elevated rupture frequency that has now given way to a longer, quieter interseismic phase. The current elapsed time of 326 years, while statistically elevated relative to the long-term average, might actually fall within the natural range of what a longer interval phase looks like for this fault. If this is correct, the 326-year wait is not an anomaly signalling imminent rupture. It is a data point consistent with the fault being in a phase where intervals naturally run longer than the historical mean. Under this framework, the current signals, the 4.8, the ETS activity, the Aleutian timing, are still worth watching, but the background probability context is somewhat less alarming than the raw 80th percentile figure suggests. The second framework looks at the same data and reaches the opposite conclusion. Proponents of this view point to the clustering behaviour evident in certain portions of the turbidite record and argue that it reflects something important about the mechanical behaviour of the Cascadia system, that the fault is capable of producing sequences of closely spaced ruptures, and that the period following a major cluster is not necessarily a long quiescent phase, but may itself be a prelude to the next cluster. Under this interpretation, 326 years of accumulated stress does not suggest the fault is in a long-interval quiet phase. It suggests the fault is a candidate for the next rupture event, and possibly the beginning of a new clustering sequence regardless of whatever phase structure is visible in the earlier record. Under this framework, the current signals are appearing at exactly the moment when a loaded, statistically elevated system might be expected to begin showing precursory behaviour. I want to be very clear about something here. Neither of these frameworks is obviously correct. Neither camp has conclusive evidence. And this is not a situation where one group of researchers is being careless or ideologically motivated while the other group has the data clearly on their side. Both interpretations are grounded in careful analysis of the same dataset. The division exists because the dataset itself is genuinely ambiguous, because the paleoseismic record, for all its remarkable preservation and analytical sophistication, does not give us the temporal resolution or the sample size needed to confidently identify which phase of a non-stationary recurrence cycle we are currently in. Here is the deep methodological problem that sits at the heart of this debate, and it is worth spelling out explicitly because it explains why this question is so hard to resolve even with 4,000 years of data. To identify whether you're in a clustering phase or a long interval phase of a non-stationary recurrence cycle, you need to observe enough complete cycles to characterize the behavior of each phase reliably. You need to see how long the clustering phases typically last, how long the quiet phases typically last, and how the transitions between them behave. And to do that, you need a record that is long relative to the duration of the phases themselves. Here is the problem. If the clustering and quiescent phases of Cascadia's recurrence behavior operate on timescales of several centuries each, which the turbidite record tentatively suggests, then 4,000 years of data gives you only a handful of complete cycles to work with. You are trying to characterize a pattern from a dataset that contains perhaps 5 to 8 full expressions of that pattern. In statistical terms, that is not a large sample. It is enough to see that the pattern exists. It is not enough to pin down its parameters with the precision you would need to confidently say where in the cycle the current moment falls. It is a bit like trying to understand the seasons by observing a planet for 3 years. You can see that something cyclical is happening. You can identify that there are warmer periods and cooler periods. But 3 years is not enough to reliably predict whether the next 3 months will bring the onset of summer or the deepening of winter, especially if the seasons on this planet are irregular in length, which the Cascadia record suggests they may be. This limitation is not a failure of science. It is an honest reflection of what 4,000 years of geological data can and cannot tell us about a system that operates on geological timescales. The researchers who work on this problem are not being evasive when they say the question cannot be definitively answered. They are being accurate, and the accurate answer, we cannot confidently identify the current phase, is itself a scientifically significant statement, because it means that both of the competing frameworks remain on the table simultaneously. There is, however, something the paleoseismic record tells us with genuine clarity, and it is worth stating precisely because it gets lost in the debate between the two interpretive frameworks. Cascadia has, at various points in its 4,000-year seismic history, produced great earthquakes at intervals as short as perhaps a century. It has also produced intervals as long as perhaps 500 or 600 years. The distribution of observed recurrence intervals is wide, wider than most people expect when they hear the average figure of 200 to 240 years cited in hazard assessments. The tails of that distribution are real, they are populated by actual historical events, and they define the genuine range of what this fault is capable of doing in terms of recurrence timing. The current elapsed time of 326 years sits comfortably within that observed range. It is not an impossible value. It is not even an extreme value. 500 or 600 year intervals have occurred. 326 years is not at the outer edge of what this fault has done before. But, and this is the critical but, sitting within the observed range is not the same as being unremarkable. 326 years is within the range. Yes, it is also above the median. It is also above the central tendency of the full margin rupture intervals. It is also at roughly the 80th percentile of the observed distribution. All of those things can be simultaneously true. The fault has waited longer before, and the fault is currently at a point in its loading history that is longer than 80% of the intervals it has historically produced. What that means, practically, is this. If you're going to dismiss the current alignment of signals as purely routine, if you're going to look at the 4.8 off Crescent City, the active ETS loading, the Aleutian timing correlation, and say, nothing to see here, this is all normal background noise, you need an affirmative argument for why the current background probability context should be discounted. You need a reason to believe that the non-stationary recurrent structure of the Cascadia system specifically places the current moment in a long interval phase, and that 326 years of accumulated stress is consistent with that phase, rather than inconsistent with it. That argument exists. Reasonable scientists make it. But it is not the default position that requires no justification. It is one side of a genuine scientific debate, with evidence on both sides, in a system where the stakes of being wrong in either direction are historically significant. The non-stationarity of Cascadia's recurrence behaviour does not make the current situation more or less dangerous in a simple linear way. What it does is make the situation more complex to interpret and more honest to hold in a state of genuine uncertainty than the simple average interval framing suggests. The fault is not on a clock, but it is not random either. It has structure. That structure is real, and right now we are standing inside it, trying to read it, with instruments that are good, but not quite good enough to tell us exactly where in the pattern we are. That uncertainty is not comfortable, but it is the truth. And in a system capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake affecting millions of people, the honest acknowledgement of uncertainty is more valuable than a false confidence in either direction. Part 12. Partial Rupture Scenario, the Real Risk. Before we leave the question of elapsed time and what it implies, There is one more dimension of Cascadia hazard that rarely receives adequate attention in popular coverage, but that geoscientists consider central to the real-world risk profile. And I want to be direct with you about why this particular piece of the story matters. Not because it is the most dramatic version of the Cascadia threat, but because it is, in many ways, the most practically relevant one for the communities that sit above the part of the fault where all of today's signals are concentrated. It is the partial rupture scenario, and understanding it changes the nature of the hazard question significantly, possibly more significantly than anything else we have discussed so far. When most people think about a Cascadia earthquake, if they think about it at all, they think about a specific image, the full rupture, the magnitude 9, the event that breaks the entire 1,200-kilometre subduction interface simultaneously from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California. The shaking that lasts for several minutes across the entire Pacific Northwest. The tsunami that arrives at the coast within 15 to 30 minutes, reaching heights that inundate entire communities. The kind of catastrophe that reshapes a region for decades. The kind that appears in the famous New Yorker article. The kind that emergency managers in Washington and Oregon have built their worst-case planning scenarios around. That scenario is real. It is not exaggerated. The paleoseismic record, the physics of subduction zone mechanics, and the 1700 event itself all confirm that Cascadia is capable of producing exactly that kind of rupture. When the full margin goes, it will be one of the most destructive natural disasters in North American history. But here is what gets left out of almost every popular treatment of the Cascadia threat. That is not the only way this fault can hurt you, and for the communities sitting above the southern portion of the fault, the segment where today's signals are concentrated, where the ETS is currently active, where the 4.8 just lit up the catalogue, the full margin rupture is not even the most immediately relevant scenario. It is a different, quieter, less cinematic version of the threat that deserves your attention right now. The turbidite record that paleoseismologists use to reconstruct Cascadia's rupture history does not show a simple sequence of full margin events, each one breaking the entire fault simultaneously and resetting the system uniformly from north to south. When researchers look at the record in detail, comparing turbidite deposits from cores taken at different points along the margin, north and south, onshore and offshore, they find something more complicated and more instructive. Not every layer in the turbidite record appears everywhere along the margin. Some layers are present in cores from Washington and Oregon, but absent or ambiguous in cores from the Southern California section. Some layers appear only in the southern cores. The pattern, when assembled carefully across multiple core sites and cross-checked against dating methods, tells a story that the full margin rupture model alone cannot accommodate. It tells a story of segmentation, of a fault that does not always break all at once, but that has, at various points in its history, produced ruptures involving only a portion of the full margin. The southern segment of Cascadia, roughly from the central Oregon coast down through the Oregon-California border region and the northern California margin, appears to have ruptured independently in a meaningful number of events in the paleoseismic record. Not in every cycle, not predictably, but enough times and with enough consistency in the spatial pattern that researchers now treat southern segment partial ruptures as a documented component of the Cascadia hazard space rather than a theoretical possibility. These events, when they occur, produce earthquakes in the magnitude 8 range. Not magnitude 9, magnitude 8. Here I need to pause, because the difference between a magnitude 8 and a magnitude 9 is one of those things that sounds like a minor technical distinction, until you understand the scale. Earthquake magnitude is logarithmic, which means each whole number step represents approximately 10 times the amplitude of ground motion and approximately 31 times the energy release. A magnitude 9 is not a bigger magnitude 8. It is between 10 and 30 times more energetic in terms of seismic moment. The two events are categorically different in scale. But, and this is the point that gets lost in the shadow of the full rupture scenario, a magnitude 8 is not a small earthquake. A magnitude 8 is catastrophic. A magnitude 8 on the southern Cascadia segment would produce severe, prolonged shaking across a large portion of the northern California and southern Oregon. It would trigger significant tsunami generation along the immediately adjacent coastline, the coastline of communities that are not as well prepared as they should be. in part because the public conversation about Cascadia has been dominated by the full margin scenario to the point where the partial rupture risk has been comparatively underemphasized. It would cause substantial casualties and infrastructure damage. It would be a defining disaster for the region it affected. It would just not be the disaster that stretches from Vancouver to the California border. It would be the disaster that stretches from roughly the Oregon-California line to the Mendocino Triple Junction. A smaller geographic footprint, a smaller magnitude, still devastating. Understanding why the southern segment is capable of rupturing independently, and why that independent behaviour is relevant to what is happening today, requires a brief return to the tectonic geography we established earlier. The northern and central segments of Cascadia behave, broadly speaking, as a coherent system. The Juan de Fuca plate is subducting beneath North America along a relatively continuous interface, and the mechanical behaviour of the fault, the locking, the stress accumulation, the ETS cycling, follows patterns that are well enough characterised to give researchers a reasonably consistent picture of the system's state. The southern segment is different, fundamentally, mechanically different. At the southern terminus, where the 4.8 just occurred, the Cascadia system does not end cleanly. It collides with two other major tectonic structures simultaneously, the San Andreas fault system from the south and the internal deformation zone of the Gorda plate, which is being pulled apart from within even as it is being subducted. The result is the Mendocino Triple Junction, one of the most mechanically complex plate boundary intersections on Earth, and it creates a stress environment in the southern Cascadia segment that has no clean analogue anywhere else along the margin. The Gorda plate, specifically, behaves in ways that are genuinely unusual for a subducting oceanic plate. Most subducting plates are relatively rigid. They deform primarily at their edges, at the subduction interface, and transmit stress through their interiors in relatively predictable ways. The Gorda plate is not like that. It is internally fractured, rotating, being pulled apart by the competing forces of subduction from above and ridge spreading from behind. It is one of the most internally deformed oceanic plates on Earth, and that internal deformation means that the stress environment it creates at the southern Cascadia interface is fragmented, irregular, and mechanically distinct from the cleaner loading geometry of the northern segment. This mechanical distinctiveness has two important consequences for the partial rupture scenario. First, it means the southern segment accumulates and distributes stress differently than the northern segment, in ways that could make it more susceptible to independent rupture, initiating a break that either stays confined to the southern segment or propagates northward depending on the stress state of the adjacent central segment at the moment of failure. Second, it means that the current ETS behaviour in the southern segment, the active slow slip event that is right now transferring stress into the locked zone, is occurring in a mechanical environment that is genuinely harder to model than the northern ETS cycles. The stress transfer is real and measurable. Its implications for the locked zone above it are less precisely characterizable than the equivalent process in Washington and British Columbia. Here is the part of this story that should genuinely concern you, separate from the seismology itself. The southern Cascadia segment, the segment where the partial rupture scenario is most relevant, where the current signals are concentrated, where the ETS is most active right now, is the worst monitored part of the entire Cascadia system. This is not an accusation. It is a consequence of geography, funding history, and the particular difficulty of instrumenting an offshore subduction zone environment. The northern segment of Cascadia, beneath Washington and southern British Columbia, benefits from a dense network of GPS stations, borehole seismometers, offshore pressure gauges, and decades of continuous data collection. Researchers working on the northern segment have a relatively rich dataset to work with. The ETS cycles are well characterized. The geodetic signals associated with slow slip events are reliably captured. The picture is not perfect, but it is substantially complete. The southern segment has none of that. The GPS network in the relevant geometry is sparser. The offshore instrumentation is minimal. The historical ETS characterization is poor enough that scientists cannot reliably establish recurrence intervals for the southern slow slip cycles, let alone track the detailed spatial evolution of individual ETS events in real time. When something happens in the southern segment, as something is clearly happening right now, Scientists are working with a dataset that is thin in exactly the places where resolution matters most. This monitoring gap has practical consequences that go beyond scientific frustration. It means that the ambiguity surrounding the current signals, the depth uncertainty of the 4.8, the difficulty of characterizing the ongoing ETS event, the inability to precisely locate the boundaries of the current slow slip zone, is not simply a feature of the scientific problem. It is partly a feature of the infrastructure deficit. Better instrumentation in the southern segment would not eliminate the uncertainty, but it would reduce it. And reduced uncertainty in a system where the partial rupture scenario represents a realistic near-term hazard for densely populated coastal communities has direct implications for emergency preparedness and public safety. The communities sitting above the southern Cascadia segment, coastal towns in northern California and southern Oregon, communities built on low-lying ground adjacent to estuaries and river mouths, communities that would have 15 minutes or less to reach high ground following a locally generated tsunami, are living above the least monitored, most mechanically complex and arguably most immediately hazardous portion of the entire Cascadia system. They are not as well prepared as the communities in Washington, which have benefited from years of public education campaigns, improved tsunami inundation mapping, and systematic emergency planning. They are not the focus of the dominant public narrative about Cascadia, which centers on the full margin rupture and its effects on Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. They are sitting above the southern segment, the segment where today's signals are pointing, the segment where a magnitude 8 partial rupture is a documented historical behavior of this fault, not a speculative scenario. The segment where the ETS is currently active, where the 4.8 just occurred, and where the monitoring picture is most incomplete at exactly the moment when the most careful watching is most warranted. The question of whether today's signals are precursors to anything is genuinely unknowable with current data. Nobody is claiming otherwise. The honest scientific answer to is something about to happen on the southern Cascadia segment is the same as it has been throughout this story. We don't know. The signals are ambiguous. The hypothesis space is open. The data is insufficient for confident conclusions in either direction. But the question of what the hazard landscape looks like for the southern segment, given its current stress state and the documented history of partial rupture behavior, is not unknowable. It is a question with a meaningful answer, and the answer is this. The southern Cascadia segment is a realistic source of a magnitude 8 or larger earthquake. It is currently experiencing active ETS loading that is transferring stress into its locked zone. It is at or beyond the median of its historical recurrence interval, and it is the least monitored portion of a fault system that is already at the 80th percentile of its full margin recurrence distribution. That combination does not produce a prediction. It produces a posture of careful, sustained, elevated attention from scientists, from emergency managers, and from the communities that live above it. Not alarm, not certainty, attention, the kind that the partial rupture scenario has always deserved and has too rarely received. The temporal alignment of signals right now is pointing at the southern segment specifically. That is the segment where the risk from partial rupture is most relevant. That is the segment where the monitoring picture is most incomplete. And that is the segment where the next signal, whatever it turns out to be, will arrive into a system that is anything but quiet underneath. Part 13. Same-Day Activity Map. While the Crescent City 4.8 was appearing in seismic catalogues and the Aleutian 5.8 was being assessed by NOAA, something else was happening across the broader West Coast Plate boundary system that, taken individually, would not merit discussion. A magnitude 3.4 cluster was occurring along the San Andreas Fault system in central California. Minor seismic swarms were appearing in northern California in regions adjacent to the main Cascadia termination zone. The San Jacinto Fault Zone, one of the most seismically active fault systems in Southern California, was producing its characteristic background microseismicity. And the Walker Lane Deformation Zone, which runs through Nevada and represents a diffuse zone of right lateral shear that some researchers consider an embryonic plate boundary, was showing its own distributed activity. None of these events are extraordinary in isolation. The California fault system produces thousands of small earthquakes every week. Seismicity along the San Andreas is continuous and highly variable, and the San Jacinto Fault in particular is one of the most productive seismogenic structures in North America by sheer event count. Any given day you sample the seismic catalogue for the western United States, you will find a distributed pattern of small to moderate earthquakes spread across multiple fault systems. That is normal. That is what an active tectonic margin does. The reason to mention these events in the same breath as the Crescent City 4.8 is not to suggest they are causally connected. It is to establish what seismologists call a distributed seismicity snapshot, a picture of how stress is being expressed simultaneously across a broad swath of the plate boundary system. And on this particular day, the snapshot shows activity distributed across multiple segments of the same overarching tectonic structure, from the Aleutians in the north to the San Jacinto in the south, with the Cascadia terminus sitting roughly in the middle of a seismically active corridor that is, as a whole, not quiet. The individual pieces are mundane. The pattern, when you step back and look at the whole map, is worth noting in the context of what the Cascadia system's stress state is currently doing. Part 14. Coincidence versus coherence. This is the point in the analysis where intellectual honesty requires drawing a very clear line. The standard scientific interpretation of simultaneous seismicity across multiple fault systems in a plate boundary region is straightforward. These are independent events, driven by the individual stress states of each fault system, occurring on timescales that happen to overlap simply because seismic activity is continuous and pervasive across active tectonic margins. Under this interpretation, looking for connections between the San Jacinto microseismicity, the Crescent City 4.8, and the Aleutian 5.8 is roughly equivalent to looking for connections between traffic jams in different cities because they all happen during the same afternoon rush hour. Each one has its own local causes. The temporal clustering is the result of sampling a continuous process, not evidence of a connected system. This is the dominant scientific view, and it is well supported by a large body of work showing that most seismic clustering in time and space can be explained by purely local mechanics without invoking plate-scale stress transfer. For the vast majority of events recorded on any given day across the western United States, this explanation is correct. The alternative framing, what some researchers call stress field adjustment or system-wide stress redistribution, is less established and considerably more contested. This framework suggests that large, connected plate boundary systems can, following significant stress perturbations like the Aleutian 5.8, enter a transient state of slightly elevated seismicity across broad regions as the stress field redistributes and adjusts. The idea is not that one earthquake triggers specific other earthquakes in a deterministic chain. It is that a connected plate system under distributed stress can show coherent responses to perturbations across large spatial scales, in a way that produces statistical clustering even without direct mechanical causation between individual events. The evidence for this hypothesis is mixed. Historical seismic catalogues do show some cases where broad regional seismicity appears to elevate following major plate boundary ruptures, and detailed statistical analyses have found clustering patterns that are difficult to explain purely by coincidence in a handful of well-documented cases. But the statistical methods required to distinguish genuine clustering from random temporal coincidence in seismic catalogues are extraordinarily demanding. The effect sizes are generally small, and the scientific community has not reached consensus on whether the observed patterns exceed what would be expected from the null hypothesis of independent events. What scientists do agree on is this: tracking the patterns is worth doing. Even if stress field adjustment effects are small or uncertain, the monitoring behaviour required to detect them, careful tracking of temporal and spatial clustering across the plate boundary system, detailed analysis of individual events in their tectonic context, close attention to the timing relationships between ETS cycles and shallow seismicity, is the exact same monitoring behaviour required to detect genuine precursory patterns if they exist. You cannot determine whether a pattern is meaningful or coincidental without first carefully documenting the pattern. And that is why the distributed seismicity picture on the day of the Crescent City 4.8 is worth noting, even if its ultimate interpretation remains open. Part 15. The controversial layer, solar and geomagnetic. Before leaving the topic of system-wide context, intellectual completeness requires acknowledging a layer of analysis that sits well outside the mainstream geophysical consensus, but that circulates actively in discussions of earthquake hazard, particularly in venues that cover space weather and solar activity. And I want to be upfront with you about something before we go here. This is the part of the video where I have to be most careful, not because the topic is dangerous, not because I think you can't handle nuance, but because this specific intersection, solar activity and earthquake triggering, is one of the most frequently distorted topics in the entire space weather and geohazard communication space. It gets overclaimed constantly, it gets dismissed just as reflexively, and neither extreme is honest. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to look at what the research actually says, what it actually doesn't say, what the current solar environment actually looks like, and what, if anything, any of that has to do with the signals we have been discussing at Cascadia. No hype, no blanket dismissal, just the honest, complicated, somewhat unsatisfying truth. Which, if you have been watching this channel for any amount of time, you know is exactly how we operate here. The claim, in its most academically responsible form, is this: geomagnetic disturbances associated with periods of elevated solar activity may exert a statistically detectable influence on seismic activity rates, particularly in regions of elevated tectonic stress. Notice the precision of that sentence. May exert. Statistically detectable. Particularly in regions of elevated tectonic stress. Every one of those qualifiers is doing real work. This is not solar flares cause earthquakes. It is not geomagnetic storms trigger ruptures. It is a carefully bounded claim about a weak statistical signal that some researchers believe they can detect in the global seismic catalogue under specific conditions. That is a completely different statement, and the difference matters enormously for how you evaluate the evidence. The research basis for this claim is real. It is not fabricated. It is not the exclusive territory of fringe websites and YouTube channels with dramatic thumbnails. Peer-reviewed studies have been published examining the relationship between geomagnetic storm indices, quantitative measures of disturbance in Earth's magnetic field driven by solar wind pressure and coronal mass ejections, and earthquake occurrence rates in global and regional seismic catalogues. Some of those studies have found correlations that exceed what would be expected by chance alone. They have been published in legitimate scientific journals. They have been cited by other researchers. They exist. But, and this is a very large but, the research basis is also limited in ways that matter critically for how much weight you should assign to it. Let's look at what the positive findings in this literature actually show, because the details are important, and they tend to get lost in the game of telephone that happens when this research moves from academic papers into popular coverage. The studies that have found correlations between geomagnetic activity and seismicity are, almost without exception, working with effect sizes that are small. Not marginally small, genuinely small. We are talking about studies that find, for example, a slight elevation in the rate of small to moderate earthquakes in the days following significant geomagnetic storms, an elevation that is statistically distinguishable from background rates in some analyses, but that represents a modest fractional increase rather than a dramatic spike. The kind of signal that requires large datasets and careful statistical methodology to detect at all, and that disappears or weakens substantially when different analytical approaches are applied to the same data. This is a red flag that experienced scientists recognize immediately. When a claimed effect is only detectable with specific methodological choices and weakens or vanishes when those choices are varied, it suggests that the effect may be partially or entirely a product of the analytical approach rather than a genuine feature of the data. It does not prove the effect is illusory. Some real physical effects genuinely are subtle and methodology sensitive, but it means the finding requires independent replication with different methods before it deserves significant weight in hazard assessment. The replication record for solar seismic correlations is mixed at best. Some studies find the correlation. Others, using different datasets or different statistical frameworks, do not. The scientific community has not reached a consensus that the effect is real, and several careful meta-analyses of the literature have concluded that the positive findings are not robust enough to survive rigorous methodological scrutiny. The majority position among researchers who have examined this question carefully is that the claimed correlation, if it exists at all, is of negligible practical significance for earthquake hazard assessment. That is the honest summary of where the science stands, not definitively proven false, not confirmed and actionable. Somewhere in the genuinely uncomfortable middle, possible in principle, weakly supported in practice, not established to the standard required for operational use in hazard forecasting. Here is the other side of the ledger that matters for evaluating this claim, the mechanism question. In science, a statistical correlation between two phenomena becomes significantly more credible when there is a plausible physical mechanism that could explain how one thing influences the other. The correlation alone is suggestive. The mechanism is what elevates it from interesting pattern to genuine physical relationship. And for the solar seismic connection, the mechanism problem is substantial. How would a geomagnetic disturbance, a fluctuation in Earth's magnetic field driven by solar-wind interaction with the magnetosphere, influence the stability of a fault locked 20 to 30 kilometers below the surface of the Earth? The honest answer is that nobody has established a confirmed mechanism. There are theoretical proposals. Several have been explored in the literature. One class of proposals involves magnetostriction, the slight deformation that some materials undergo when exposed to changing magnetic fields. If crustal rocks near a fault zone experience tiny deformations in response to geomagnetic fluctuations, could those deformations, in a system already near failure, provide the marginal perturbation needed to initiate slip? Theoretically possible. Experimentally, the effect sizes involved appear far too small to be relevant. The deformations produced by realistic geomagnetic disturbances in typical crustal materials are orders of magnitude smaller than the stress changes required to trigger fault rupture. Another class of proposals involves electromagnetic induction effects in conductive crustal fluids. The idea that geomagnetically induced currents in groundwater or hydrothermal systems could alter pore fluid pressure near fault zones, and that pore pressure changes could in turn influence fault stability. This mechanism is physically more plausible in principle, because pore fluid pressure is a known modulator of fault strength, and small changes in pore pressure can, under the right conditions, meaningfully affect fault stability. But the quantitative case for geomagnetically induced pore pressure changes large enough to matter for earthquake triggering has not been made convincingly, and the spatial and temporal scales involved are difficult to reconcile with the observed correlation patterns in the seismic catalogue. A third class of proposals skips the subsurface entirely and focuses on atmospheric and ionospheric effects, changes in the electrical environment of the lower atmosphere during geomagnetic storms that might somehow couple downward into the solid Earth. This is the most speculative family of mechanisms, and it has the weakest physical grounding of the three. It appears primarily in the more peripheral corners of the literature. None of these mechanisms have been confirmed experimentally. None have been demonstrated to produce effects at magnitudes relevant to fault triggering in realistic geological settings. And the absence of a confirmed mechanism is not a minor technical detail. It is a fundamental part of why the majority scientific view is skeptical of the correlation even in the studies that appear to find it. A correlation without a mechanism is a pattern looking for an explanation. It might be real. It might be a statistical artifact. Without the mechanism, you cannot tell. With all of that context established, let us look at what is actually happening in the solar environment right now. Because there is a factual statement to be made here, separate from the contested question of whether it matters for seismicity. We are currently in solar cycle 25, and this cycle has proven more active than many forecasters predicted at its outset. Solar maximum, the period of peak activity in the approximately 11-year solar cycle, is either upon us now or was reached very recently, depending on which smoothing methodology you apply to the sunspot data. Activity has been elevated. Significant solar flares and coronal mass ejections have occurred with notable frequency over the past year or two. Geomagnetic storm activity, measured by the KP index and related metrics, has reflected that elevated solar output with periods of moderate to strong geomagnetic disturbance reaching Earth's magnetosphere. This is factual. It is observable. It is the kind of information that Project Nightwatch covers because it is relevant to a wide range of phenomena: aurora visibility, satellite operations, GPS accuracy, power grid stability, HF radio propagation. The elevated solar activity is real, and its effects on Earth's near-space environment are well documented and operationally significant for multiple industries and scientific programs. Whether that elevated geomagnetic activity has any meaningful interaction with the stress state of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, or any other fault system, is, in honest scientific terms, unknown and considered unlikely by the majority of researchers who have examined the question carefully. Those two things can both be true simultaneously. The solar activity is real. Its seismic relevance is unestablished. Here is the honest reason this layer is in the video, and I want to be transparent about it because I think you deserve that transparency. This channel exists at the intersection of space weather, solar activity, and the physical systems those phenomena interact with. When all of the other signals we have discussed today, the ETS loading, the Aleutian timing, the depth ambiguity of the 4.8, the 326-year background, are already assembling into an alignment window worth discussing, and the solar environment is simultaneously at an elevated state, the intellectually honest thing to do is acknowledge that coincidence rather than pretend it isn't there, not to build a case from it. The case for scientific attention to the Cascadia signals stands completely independently of the solar layer. Remove the geomagnetic context entirely and you still have 3 stacked, individually explainable signals occurring simultaneously on a fault at the 80th percentile of its recurrence distribution. That is sufficient on its own merits, but a story about signal stacking that omits a signal, even a contested, weakly supported, mechanistically unconfirmed signal, because it is inconvenient or because engaging with it risks association with less rigorous coverage, is not an honest story, it is a curated story. And curation, in the service of avoiding uncomfortable ambiguity, is its own form of distortion. The geomagnetic layer belongs in the category of speculative but not impossible. The effect, if it exists, is small. The mechanism is unconfirmed. The majority scientific view is skeptical, all of that is true. And it is also true that elevated solar activity is currently influencing Earth's geomagnetic environment, and that this is happening at the same time as every other signal in this alignment window. Whether that adds to the picture or merely decorates it is a question the data cannot currently answer. But leaving it out entirely, pretending the question doesn't exist because the answer is uncomfortable, would be a disservice to you and to the complexity of what is actually happening right now in the tectonic and space weather environments simultaneously. So consider it noted, weigh it accordingly, which is to say, lightly, with genuine skepticism about the underlying science, and with the full awareness that the Cascadia story is compelling and concerning entirely without it. But consider it noted, because on a channel called Project Nightwatch, the thing we do not do is look away from signals just because they are inconvenient to discuss, even the quiet ones, even the contested ones, even the ones that make scientists uncomfortable to be asked about in polite company. We look, we report what we see, and we let you decide what to make of it. Part 16. The 6 competing hypotheses. When seismologists sit down to interpret an event like the 4.8 off Crescent City, in the context of everything that was happening around it, they do not operate by reaching for a single explanation and committing to it. They work through what researchers sometimes call a hypothesis space. A structured set of competing interpretations, each consistent with some portion of the available data, that must be evaluated against each other as new information arrives. For this particular event, the hypothesis space contains at least 6 distinct interpretations, each of which has supporting rationale, and each of which makes different predictions about what signals should or should not appear in the data over the coming hours, days, and weeks. The first hypothesis is the most parsimonious. This is routine Gorda plate internal deformation. The Gorda plate fractures constantly under the internal stresses generated by the forces acting on it from multiple directions. A shallow earthquake at or near the southern Cascadia terminus is a common occurrence under this explanation. The depth ambiguity is a normal feature of offshore real-time catalogue processing, and the temporal proximity to the Aleutian event is coincidence at the level of sampling noise. Under this hypothesis, the 4.8 would be expected to sit in isolation. No subsequent clustering, no elevated tremor activity specifically associated with the event location, no detectable geodetic signal. Scientists would note it, catalogue it, and expect nothing further. The second hypothesis is dynamic triggering. Under this interpretation, the surface waves from the Aleutian 5.8 arrived at the Cascadia terminus and perturbed a fault segment that was already near its failure threshold due to active ETS loading, inducing the 4.8 earlier than it would otherwise have occurred. The key prediction of this hypothesis is that the triggering effect, if real, should be detectable as a brief elevation in seismicity rates at or near the Cascadia terminus in the hours following the Aleutian rupture, a cluster of small events that decays rapidly as the passing wavefront moves on. If the subsequent seismicity catalogue shows normal background rates with no clustering signature, dynamic triggering becomes less likely as the primary explanation. If a short-term cluster appears, it becomes more likely. The third hypothesis is ETS-induced slip. Under this interpretation, the 4.8 is not a coincidental event and is not dynamically triggered from the Aleutians, but is instead a direct mechanical consequence of the active slow slip event currently underway beneath the southern segment. ETS events are known to produce small magnitude seismic events at the edges of the slow slip zone as stress concentrations develop at the boundaries of the creeping region. A shallow earthquake at the southern terminus of the ETS active zone, occurring during an active slow slip episode, could be an ETS boundary event rather than a conventional tectonic earthquake. This hypothesis predicts that the event should be accompanied by other small earthquakes in a spatial pattern consistent with the edges of the slow slip zone, and that tremor activity in the region should continue to be elevated following the event as the slow slip progresses. The fourth hypothesis combines elements of the second and third, a combined ETS plus Aleutian triggering scenario in which both the preloading from the slow slip event and the dynamic perturbation from the Aleutian surface waves contributed to the occurrence of the 4.8. This is the most complex of the hypotheses and the hardest to test, because it requires demonstrating the contribution of two separate mechanisms simultaneously. But it is also the hypothesis that the current physical context, active ETS plus precisely timed distant rupture, most naturally suggests. Its predictions are a combination of those from hypotheses 2 and 3, plus a slight elevation in the probability of additional small events in the region in the near term. The fifth hypothesis is the one that makes scientists most uncomfortable: foreshock scenario. Under this interpretation, the 4.8 is a foreshock to a larger event that has not yet occurred. This is the hypothesis that cannot be tested prospectively. You can only identify foreshocks retrospectively after the main shock has occurred by looking backward at what preceded it. Statistically, most moderate earthquakes are not foreshocks, but some are. And no current seismological technique can reliably distinguish a foreshock from a standalone event at the time it occurs. The hypothesis cannot be confirmed or ruled out. It can only be assigned a probability based on the statistical foreshock rates for events of similar magnitude in similar tectonic settings. And in the current context, that probability, while small, is elevated relative to a Cascadia terminus event occurring outside of an active ETS episode and without the Aleutian temporal correlation. The sixth hypothesis is the broadest: regional stress field adjustment. Under this interpretation, the 4.8 is one expression of a transient adjustment in the stress field of the Pacific North American plate boundary system following the Aleutian rupture, and the relevant unit of analysis is not the individual event but the pattern of seismicity across the plate boundary system over the next several weeks. This is the hypothesis that connects all the individual signals into a single system-level frame, and it makes the least specific predictions about individual events while making meaningful predictions about aggregate regional seismicity rates. No single one of these hypotheses can be ruled out with the data currently available. All six remain physically plausible given what we know, and the state of scientific attention to the southern Cascadia terminus right now reflects exactly this situation: a hypothesis space that has not yet been pruned by incoming data, in a system where the stakes of premature pruning are very high. Part 17. Why no one is dismissing it. Understanding why scientists are paying close attention to the 4.8 requires understanding something specific about how scientific monitoring behavior actually works, because the attention itself is not being driven by alarm, or by a belief that a rupture is imminent, or by any of the things that would be implied if this story were being told by someone with an agenda around fear. It is not being driven by panic. It is not being driven by a worst-case interpretation of ambiguous data. It is being driven by something considerably more mundane and considerably more important than either of those things. It is being driven by a technical judgment about signal stacking and hypothesis evaluation, and to understand why that judgment produces elevated attention rather than a closed file, you need to understand something about the specific professional reality of the people who monitor hazardous fault systems for a living. Scientists who work on hazardous fault systems, seismologists, geodesists, geophysicists who have dedicated their careers to understanding systems like Cascadia. live with a professional asymmetry that most other scientists never have to confront in quite the same way. It is an asymmetry of consequences, and it shapes every decision they make about how to respond to ambiguous signals. Here is the asymmetry stated plainly. If a pattern of signals appears, and it is genuinely ambiguous, and you dismiss it too quickly and move on, and it turns out the signals were meaningful, the cost of that error is potentially catastrophic. Not professionally embarrassing, not a setback to your research program. Catastrophic. In the context of a fault capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake affecting millions of people across multiple states, premature closure on a signal pattern that turned out to be precursory is not a correctable mistake. There is no version of that error that you get to fix afterward. If a pattern of signals appears and it is genuinely ambiguous, and you watch it carefully, allocate monitoring resources to it, run the additional analyses, cross-reference the timeline, check the tremor catalogues more frequently, and it turns out the signals were routine and nothing further occurs, the cost of that error is a few weeks of elevated data analysis effort, some additional computational time, some researchers spending more hours than usual staring at data streams that ultimately show nothing anomalous. The signal decays back to background. The hypothesis space gets pruned by incoming data. Life continues. Science continues. Those two errors are not symmetric. They are not even close to symmetric. And under that asymmetry, responsible scientists who work on systems like Cascadia consistently, deliberately, and appropriately are on the side of watching more carefully rather than closing the file. Not because they believe disaster is near, not because they are catastrophists or alarmists or people who need the drama of an impending rupture to justify their research programs, but because the arithmetic of consequences makes premature closure the wrong choice when the system in question is capable of producing one of the most destructive natural disasters in North American history. This is not a controversial position within the scientific community. It is not a minority view held by the more excitable researchers, while their cooler-headed colleagues dismiss ambiguous signals without a second look. It is the standard operational posture of responsible monitoring science applied to high-hazard systems. Watch carefully, analyze thoroughly. Resist the temptation of premature closure. Let the incoming data prune the hypothesis space, rather than pruning it yourself based on what you expect to see. Here is something important to understand. The magnitude of the 4.8 is not what is driving the scientific attention. Let me say that again, because it is easy to miss. The 4.8 itself, as a seismic event, as a number in a catalogue, is not particularly interesting to the researchers monitoring the system. A 4.8 is a small earthquake. Scientists who work on Cascadia see events of this magnitude regularly. The Gorda Plate fractures constantly. The southern terminus of the subduction zone produces small earthquakes as a matter of routine background behaviour. Under normal circumstances, a 4.8 in this region would receive exactly the level of attention its magnitude suggests, which is to say, it would be logged, processed by automated systems, added to the catalogue, and forgotten by the end of the working day. What is driving the attention is the alignment of conditions that produce the 4.8, or more precisely, the alignment of conditions that existed in the system at the moment the 4.8 appeared. Because those conditions are not normal background circumstances, they are a specific configuration of simultaneously active factors that, taken together, place the event in a context that cannot be easily explained away. Active ETS loading, transferring stress into the locked zone from below. A statistical position at or above the 80th percentile of the historical recurrence distribution. A temporal correlation with a distant plate boundary rupture at exactly the window when that rupture's surface waves would have been sweeping through the southern Cascadia terminus. An ambiguous depth measurement that places the event potentially near the megathrust interface rather than definitively in the upper crust. Each of those conditions is individually interesting. Collectively, they constitute a pattern that is qualitatively different from a 4.8 occurring in the same location on a quiet day, mid-interseismic cycle, with no ETS activity, no recent distant ruptures, and a well-resolved depth placing it unambiguously in the upper crust of the Gorda Plate. Same magnitude, different context, completely different level of warranted attention. And this is precisely what the scientists monitoring this system are responding to. Not the number, but the context around the number. There is a distinction that I think is critically important for you to understand. Because without it, the absence of public alerts or official statements about the 4.8 could easily be misread as scientific indifference. It is not. Public scientific communication about earthquake hazard is deliberately conservative, not accidentally conservative, not conservatively conservative because the agencies involved are bureaucratic and slow-moving, deliberately conservative for reasons that are well grounded in the history of earthquake hazard communication and the documented consequences of getting it wrong. Premature alarm based on ambiguous signals causes real, measurable damage that has nothing to do with whether an earthquake actually occurs. When official or semi-official voices raise concern about a potential seismic event based on signals that ultimately prove routine, communities are disrupted. Economic activity is affected. People make decisions about travel, about evacuation, about where to spend the night, based on information that turns out to have been premature. And most importantly, public trust in the scientific institutions responsible for hazard communication is eroded in ways that are difficult to rebuild and that make the job of communicating genuine hazard changes harder in every future instance. The agencies responsible for Cascadia monitoring are not issuing public alerts about the 4.8. They should not be. There is no scientific basis for a public alert at this stage, and issuing one would be irresponsible given the current state of the data and the genuine ambiguity of the hypothesis space. The signals are interesting, they are not conclusive, and the gap between interesting and conclusive is precisely the gap that public communication protocols are designed to preserve. But, and this is the part that matters for understanding what is actually happening right now, the absence of a public alert is not the same as the absence of scientific attention. These are two completely separate categories of response, operating on completely different criteria, serving completely different functions. Conflating them leads to a misreading of the situation that goes in one of two wrong directions, either assuming that because there is no public alert, there is nothing worth paying attention to, or assuming that the absence of a public alert represents some kind of institutional suppression of information that the public deserves to know. Neither of those readings is correct. What is actually happening in the relevant scientific community right now is elevated attention without elevated public alarm. More eyes on the data streams than would normally be allocated to a 4.8, more frequent checking of tremor catalogues, looking for any change in the rate, spatial distribution, or character of tremor episodes in the Northern California cluster. More careful scrutiny of GPS time series from the network stations closest to the southern Cascadia terminus, watching for any geodetic signal that might indicate an acceleration of the ongoing slow slip event or a change in its spatial pattern. More careful cross-referencing of the precise timeline between the Aleutian rupture and the Crescent City event, reconstructing exactly when the Aleutian surface waves arrived at the southern terminus and whether the timing of the 4.8 is consistent with a dynamic triggering signature. None of this is visible to the public, because it is not the kind of monitoring activity that generates press releases or public statements. It is the kind of monitoring activity that generates internal data analysis, informal communications between researchers, more frequent looks at automated alert dashboards, and careful documentation of the evolving signal picture in case the incoming data begins to tell a more coherent story in one direction or the other. It is quiet, it is methodical, it is exactly what responsible monitoring of a high-hazard system looks like when ambiguous signals appear and the hypothesis space has not yet been pruned, and it is entirely appropriate, not alarming, not reassuring either, appropriate, which in the specific context of a 326-year-old loaded fault producing stacked signals at its most mechanically complex terminus is exactly the word the situation calls for. The scientists are watching, carefully, quietly, professionally. And the fact that they are watching, that the signals are interesting enough in context to warrant the elevated attention of people who see hundreds of small earthquakes every year and have developed finely calibrated intuitions about which ones deserve a second look, is itself a signal worth paying attention to, not a reason for alarm, a reason to keep watching, which is, after all, exactly what we're doing here. Part 18. The real question. We have been building toward a question, and now we're going to ask it plainly. Not the sensationalist version of the question, not is the big one coming tomorrow, but the genuine scientific question that the current signal stack is raising. Has the system state of the Cascadia Subduction Zone shifted? Not dramatically, not unambiguously, but measurably at the margins, in ways that affect the probability distribution of outcomes over the coming months and years. That is the question. And it is a harder question than it might appear, because answering it requires distinguishing between two possibilities that look similar in the current data. The first possibility is that the current alignment of signals, the ETS activity, the 4.8, the Aleutian timing, represents a transient coincidence of independent processes that will resolve without consequence. The ETS event will complete its slow slip cycle over the next few weeks. The seismicity near the Crescent City terminus will return to background rates. The Aleutian 5.8 will fade into the catalogue as a routine event, and in 6 months, the situation will look indistinguishable from any other period in Cascadia's interseismic loading. Under this possibility, the system state has not shifted in any meaningful way, and the current attention will prove to have been appropriate caution, rather than early warning. The second possibility is more subtle. The current alignment of signals represents not a dramatic departure from the Cascadia system's interseismic behaviour, but a slight shift in its stress state, a step function, small in absolute terms, that moves the probability distribution of outcomes marginally but genuinely toward the more hazardous end. The ETS loading has transferred a measurable stress pulse into the locked zone. The 4.8, whatever its ultimate cause, has redistributed stress locally near the southern terminus. The system is not at the same stress state it was 6 months ago, and if another ETS episode begins in the northern segment, while the southern segment is still recovering from the current slow slip pulse, the net effect on the locked zone's loading could be additive rather than sequential. The difference between these two possibilities is not catastrophic in magnitude. It is the difference between a probability of great rupture in the next 50 years that is, say, 15%, and one that is 17%. Not dramatic, not alarming, but real, and real shifts in probability, even small ones, matter when you're talking about an event that would reshape the Pacific Northwest on a timescale of decades. This is the scientific posture that responsible earthquake researchers maintain. Not predicting catastrophe, not dismissing signals, but carefully tracking whether the subtle accumulation of stress expressions is moving the system's state in one direction or the other. It is an uncomfortable posture to hold, because it produces no clean narrative. It produces no all clear and no brace yourself. It produces instead a continuous iterative assessment of an ambiguous situation by people who understand better than anyone that certainty in this domain is the province of hindsight rather than foresight. The 4.8 off Crescent City will almost certainly not be the earthquake that geologists study for the next century. It will almost certainly fade from the record as one more data point in the long interseismic loading of a fault that has been building its next rupture for 326 years. The scientists watching it know this. They are not catastrophists. They are not alarmists. They are people who understand that the most dangerous thing you can do in front of a loaded fault is decide in advance that the next signal you see will be the one you can safely ignore. And so they watch, because that is what you do when you're standing at the southern terminus of the longest seismically active plate boundary in North America, in the 326th year of a loading cycle, during an active slow slip event, 15 minutes after a rupture 4,000 kilometers away swept its surface waves through the exact location where a small earthquake just lit up the catalogue. You watch, you analyse, you resist the temptation of premature closure, and you understand, with the full weight of the paleoseismic record behind you, that the most consequential earthquakes in human history were preceded by signals that someone, somewhere, decided were too small to matter. Small earthquakes do not scare scientists. What scares them is when small earthquakes start lining up with everything else. And right now, off the coast of Crescent City, California, at the southern terminus of a fault that has not produced its expected great earthquake, in 80% of its historically observed recurrence intervals, a 4.8 is sitting in the catalogue, lining up with everything else. The fault is still locked, the stress is still building, the slow slip event is still running, the surface waves from the Aleutians have already passed through, and the next signal, whatever it is, whenever it comes, will arrive into a system that is not at the beginning of its story. It is very close to the end.